I'm one of the few people who has been to every single conference of parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the last one being the 26th Conference of Parties, COP26, which was held in Glasgow in Scotland in November last year, 2021. The next one, COP27, is going to be held in Egypt in November this year, 2022. And I'm going to share some thoughts based on my experience of all the previous COPs with respect to how we can improve the outcomes from the conferences of parties that are going to come. The first point I'm going to make is that the Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention, held every year, are gatherings of the governments of the countries that have signed up to the convention and ratified it. And each year they take stock of progress and they decide on what to do next. And while there have been some successes, but primarily the biggest success being the Paris Agreement achieved at COP21 in Paris, France in 2015, where we agreed to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees. And the developed countries promised to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries to tackle climate change. Unfortunately, we are not on track on either of those promises. So promises are made, decisions are made, but they're not kept. And we need to be better at keeping promises that are made and implementing them. So I argue now that the need for governments to sit together and negotiate new decisions is far less important than actually doing things, implementing decisions that have already been made. And for implementation, governments are certainly important, and we had a very recent example of the United States passing legislation on climate change, very far-reaching legislation, but mainly for domestic action, which is absolutely essential. But they didn't make any legislation for their contribution to the global funding that they are part of. We hope that that will follow. But the point I'm making about implementation is that implementation does not need governments alone. It can be done by many different actors. It can be done by civil society actors, mayors of cities, CEOs of companies, other leaders around the world, even young people, youth, like the Fridays for Future. All of these groups now can actually do things and are increasingly doing things. And what we want to do is to highlight their performance and their activities at these annual conferences of parties, where many of them also participate. So the Conference of Parties is primarily governments negotiating, but not only governments. It also has non-governmental actors and participants coming, meeting and talking, and forming what I call coalitions of action. The big difference between having a coalition of actors and action and the formal negotiations is that formal negotiations are meant to be and can only come to a decision on an agreement by consensus. Every country has to agree. And if one country doesn't agree, we don't achieve consensus. And therefore, we have fallen short on many, many different things. And I'm going to highlight one part of the climate change problem that is now a far more important and emerging urgent action, and that is dealing with the impacts of climate change that are already happening and causing losses and damages to people all over the world. We are seeing that happen. It's very, very apparent. Every single day, somewhere in the world, there is a major climatic event that causes both death and destruction, loss and damage, and we need to tackle it, but we are failing to do so. In COP26, the developing countries asked for creation of a new loss and damage finance facility. They didn't get it. Instead, they got from the developed countries pushback and only an agreement to have a dialogue on finance for loss and damage. And that's also for in 3 years. So they plan to talk for 3 years and not do a damn thing. That's not acceptable. Developing countries are now asking for loss and damage finance to be put on the agenda for COP27. It has been accepted by the UNFCCC Secretariat and COP27 presidency on the provisional agenda for COP27, but that will have to be resolved on the first day of the COP. If the developed countries push back and refuse to have an agenda item on loss and damage in COP27, then from a developing country perspective, particularly from a vulnerable country's perspective and the perspective of vulnerable communities in the developing world, COP27 will, at the very beginning, be a failure, even before it starts formally, if we fail to get loss and damage on the agenda. And it should be a standing agenda for every COP from now on.